We are back. As of late, I've been thinking about the Sliver Swarm precon a lot. I talked about it previously on this channel in my video about typal decks and its value as a teaching tool, given that slivers introduce players to a large number of keywords and are fairly easy to grasp once you learn a few of these, given the all creatures, all abilities nature of the creature type. However, the design of its face commander, Sliver Gravemother, and how it does or doesn't synergize with the rest of the list has been plaguing my mind, consuming my waking hours and slithering its tendrils into my dreams. While I could air my thoughts in healthy discussion with others like a well-adjusted human being, I have a YouTube channel, so I'm passing these thoughts on to you! For the longest time, Sliver Swarm has sat unmodified on my shelf because I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it. Did I just drop the 30 to 40 pounds for a single of one of the more established Sliver commanders, like the First, Legion, or Overlord, and use the basis of the list to provide the key abilities I otherwise needed? Did I do what I'd seen a lot of other players do with the precon and just run Hive Lord as its commander? Neither of these really appealed, given that, particularly by comparison to other cards of the creature type, Gravemother actually has a particularly interesting, if somewhat malign, set abilities on her that I actually wanted to better build into, despite the lack of support for it in the precon list. Before we get into things proper, I will say that this is not a deck tech. I'd much rather give you my thoughts and considerations on how I might approach making changes to the deck, rather than giving you a prescriptive list. Also, this is very much just my opinion. I appreciate the work done from a design perspective to put this deck and the 3 complementary decks released alongside it together, and I'm not looking to just rip it, particularly not without consideration. Anyway, onwards. So let's have a look at Gravemother herself. For Wooburg, we get a 6/6 legendary sliver with the legend rule doesn't apply to slivers you control. Each sliver in your graveyard has Encore X, where X is its mana value, and Encore 5. First, let's talk about Encore. As those of you who watch my keywords video will know, Encore was introduced in Commander Legends, and it's an activated ability that can be activated when the creature with it is in the graveyard. You pay the cost, exile the creature from your graveyard, then create a token copy for each opponent that has haste, must attack that player if able, and is sacrificed at the end step. The upside of having this on your commander is pretty big. You effectively get 2 uses out of her per instance of tax, given that if you cast Gravemother and she's then destroyed, you can choose to let her go to the graveyard and then encore her to put 18 power on the board. This works in her case where it wouldn't for other legendaries due to her first line of rules text, where otherwise you'd need a mirror box or another card that we're going to come back to later. So for your commander, Encore can be great. It can also be great in general, allowing you to create huge turns by encoring creatures and threatening all of your opponents simultaneously. But there are issues, or at least perceived issues, with the mechanic. The first I'm going to talk about is a player gripe, and the other is an issue with the combination of slivers and this ability. Gripe the first. Players don't like exiling their own stuff from their graveyards, they just don't. There's an inherent feels bad to sending our own stuff to the Shadow Realm, never to be seen again, despite the clear upside of being able to put 3 copies on the board for a turn. This extends beyond Encore, and is exemplified by the fact that you basically never see the Kenrith's Royal Funeral being played, despite having a very strong effect of card draw and cost reduction for the low cost of flushing 2 legends out of the airlock. Okay. Yeah, it was in Aftermath, and we all know that basically means it doesn't exist, but still. Also, shout out to Quinn for spreading the gospel of this card. Gripe the second. The lion's share of Sliver's grant abilities that do not benefit from having multiple copies or instances of them, like flying, haste, double strike, first strike, menace, shroud, and so on and so forth. There are exceptions like the stat buffing Sinew Sliver, Blade Sliver, and Megantic Sliver, which can absolutely be game enders when paired with evasive effects like that of Shifting Sliver. But for the most part, you're just giving yourself 3 extra bodies for a turn, that in the case of slivers probably have a bunch of keywords. We do, however, have the very silly situation where encoring slivers with ETB triggers in 4-player games creates 9 triggers, due to each entering with 3 instances of the ability. Here's where encoring Constricting Sliver, which exiles a creature until it leaves the battlefield, can essentially clear a table of blockers for a turn. This was clearly a consideration with the design of Regal Sliver, a new card for the precon, which, if encored, if you're already the Monarch, gives your Slivers +9/+9 until end of turn, or otherwise makes you the Monarch and gives your Slivers +8/+8. Scary stuff. Well, we can't talk about Sliver Swarm without talking about the mana base, can we? It was heavily criticized at release, to say the least. There is a clear plan here. There's 11 basics across all colors, after playing 2 of which, all of Cinderglade, Canopy Vista, Prairie Stream, Smoldering Marsh, and Sunken Hollow will enter untapped. All of these have basic land types, making them fetchable with the slow fetches like Mountain Valley and Rocky Tar Pit. This plan is further supported with Nature's Law and 3 visits, which both get us an untapped forest. So if you've got your 2 basics, you can go get Canopy Vista or Cinderglade and bring them in untapped. Or you can fix your colors further by getting one of the 2 color cycle lands like Sheltered Thicket or Scattered Groves. Alongside Command Tower, Exotic Orchards, Secluded Courtyard, and Unclaimed Territory, as well as the tri-lands like Opulent Palace and Frontier Bivouac, we will get our 5 colors of mana that we need to play our commander, and all our slivers, just slowly. The fact that of our 37 lands, 16 will always enter tapped creates an issue. If we wanted to improve our fixing, we'd be tempted to add Chromatic Lantern and or Leyline of the Guild Pack to our list, but even with these, we're losing time getting our 5 colors online. You can attempt to remedy this with Spelunking and Amulet of Vigor, but having to bank on drawing these cards not to lose a lot of turns playing lands that would otherwise come in tapped doesn't feel great. Obviously, these issues are somewhat eased by the presence of both Mana Weft and Gemhide Sliver, which both let all of your slivers tap for a mana of any color, but after spending the £75 plus asking price, don't say premium product, finding all of these issues out of the box is a little bit of a pinch point. This is purely speculative, but given how dominating an archetype slivers can be, a slower mana base feels in part like a balancing consideration. Part of the design of a precon release is the idea that a pot of 4 can each take one of the new decks, shuffle up, and play a reasonably balanced game. And the combination of slivers with a hyper-efficient mana base would likely lead to some pretty one-sided games. Efficient WUBRG mana bases are always going to be expensive, given that shocks, fetches, and triomes are all north of £10 each due to the speed and consistency they provide. But it does feel like there could have been at least a couple more efficient jewels, like the Fast Lands or Bond Lands, a number of which were reprinted in Commander Masters. Also, where the hell is Sliver Hive? I'm not going to spend an extended period of time telling you how to fix this mana base, as when it comes to 5 colors, the answer is usually just more money. But I'd be tempted by reducing the number of lands that always enter tapped as much as possible without breaking the bank, if just to make including 5 color fixes like the aforementioned Chromatic Lantern or Leyline the Guild Pact feel a little bit better. But anyway, this isn't an upgrade guide, more of a dissection. One of the things this deck is great for is providing a starter kit for those who want to build a Sliver deck. With a whopping 41 slivers in the list, including the Gravemother herself, most of the key effects you'd be looking for are represented here. The downside of this is that after 44 creatures and 37 lands, we're only left with 19 slots with which to support our commander's ability. Take away ramp spells and we're down to 11. The presence of Typal Staples Herald's Horn, Vanquisher's Banner, and Icon of Ancestry are all welcome, offering card draw of our chosen creature type, as well as stat buffs in the case of Icon and Banner, and cost reduction in the case of the Horn. Otherwise, we've got more card draw from Distant Melody and Windfall, which has the added benefit of letting us dump some slivers into the yard, some spot removal from Decimate, and a couple wipes with Cleansing Nova, Crippling Fear, and Harsh Mercy. Cleansing Nova is obviously at its best when we've got Hive Lord on our board, and our creatures will dodge the wipe. Crippling Fear will help wipe our opponent's low to the ground threats and gets around indestructible, but Harsh Mercy is one that always feels a bit of an underperformer. It's costed well at white and 2 generic, but given that most players will likely be playing at least a couple of repeat creature types even outside of typal lists, it usually just takes a couple creatures off the board. There are cases where the card puts opponents in tricky positions, forcing them to choose between 2 creatures with matching types and one that they'd maybe rather keep. But given the omnipresence of double and triple type creatures in modern Magic, there's often a workaround to be found. Suffice to say, any changes you make to this list are going to involve cutting some slivers. If you were looking for where you might make some cuts, the answer is likely found in the effects that have redundancy, or that you're not going to especially miss, which is more down to personal preference. Obviously, redundancy is deeply important in a singleton format. This is perhaps a point to revisit in a future video, but there is a balancing act to be found in how consistently you want to have access to a certain effect, and where you might benefit from a bit more diversity. Diversity is good. 6 slivers, these being Blade, Bone Splitter, Cleaving, Megantic, Might, and Sinew, all provide stat bonuses with varying levels of efficiency. There's a hair in my eye. Ugh. These do synergize well with Gravemother, stacking for each copy on the board, but just how many you actually need is another question. Personally, with the approach that I would take to making this deck more synergistic with Gravemother, there are some slivers I would perhaps choose to include instead of a couple of these. Sinew is likely the most efficient of the bunch, giving +1/+1 to all slivers for 1 white and 1 generic, while Megantic is the biggest buff at +3/+3 for 1 green and 5 generic. And I personally think you can probably get away with just these 2 or maybe even 1 of them. Blur, Cloud Shredder, and Firewake all give our slivers haste. Cloud Shredder is the most efficient, giving haste and flying for just Boros, and Blur is the least, giving just haste for 1 red and 2 generic. Firewake costs Gruul and 1, and offers haste as well as giving all slivers the ability to give target sliver +2/+2 until end of turn for 1 generic and sacrificing the sliver. This is important. Only Firewake and Necrotic Sliver, which gives all slivers the ability to destroy target permanent for 3 generic and sacrificing the sliver, give us sacrifice abilities. If we were following the typical sliver game plan, these would be nice utility options to help buff our slivers to lethal or get rid of a problem piece on an opponent's board, but not something we were looking to utilize unless we really needed to. We obviously want all of our slivers to hit the board and stay there, so we have access to as many abilities as possible. But in Gravemother's unique brand of sliver gameplay, we want to have at least one of these in our list, because otherwise we don't really have a way of fueling our encores, other than crossing our fingers and hoping our stuff gets removed by our opponents. This runs pretty counterintuitive to the common game plan of getting that magic combo of Crystalline Sliver or Diffusion Sliver on board with Hive Lord, so our board is nigh on impervious. Obviously, Farewell, Cyclonic Rift, Toxic Deluge, and the like are still going to be issues, but when are they not? It's for the same reason that in my iterations of my mod, I put Hollowhead Sliver back in, despite initially taking it out. Giving all of your slivers the ability to tap and discard a card to draw a card is obviously a good card draw effect, but it's doubly important for Gravemother as we need more ways to fill our yard with slivers we can encore. Part of needing slivers to actually hit the yard is why neither Clot or Crypt Sliver made the cut for me, with both giving slivers the ability to regenerate as a form of protection. It can be nice for dodging wipes or spot removal, but the lack of an ability that stacks, combined with keeping our slivers out of the yard where we actually want at least some of them, makes them feel like they lack a bit of the synergy that we're otherwise trying to improve. For this reason, Hibernation Sliver, which has the admittedly really useful ability of giving all slivers return this permanent to its owner's hand for the low cost of 2/2 life, is also not in my Gravemother centric list. Of the remaining 14 slivers, which are in the core list and not new designs, 9 give keywords and 5 give triggered abilities. Let's go over them now. Gale Rider Sliver giving flying for just 1 blue mana is an obvious must run, but Winged Sliver looks less necessary, giving the same effect for an additional generic when you've also got Cloud Shredder giving flying, as well as more evasion from Two-Headed Sliver's Menace, and Shifting Sliver making all slivers unblockable except by other slivers. Is the word sliver starting to sound weird to you? Sliver. Quick Sliver allows any player to play sliver spells as though they had flash for 1 green and 1 generic. This really lets us maximize the value of the 2 slivers in the list that turn our board into dorks, allowing us to hold up blockers on our opponent's turns, then using the end step before our turn to flash in more slivers. Striking Sliver gives our board first strike for 1 red, while Bone Scythe Sliver gives our board double strike for 3 generic and 1 white. Bone Scythe lets us double our combat damage triggers with 2 instances of damage, which makes it feel worth the extra expense. Sentinel Sliver gives Vigilance for 1 white and 1 generic, which helps protect us from being attacked, as well as again maximizing Gem Hide and Mana Weft. Venom Sliver gives Death Touch for 1 green and 1 generic, disincentivizing our opponents from both attacking or blocking us, and Siphon Sliver gives Lifelink for black and 2 generic, which, given the heat we're likely going to get just for playing slivers in the first place, makes it a pretty worthwhile include. On to that last batch of triggered abilities, which our commander obviously loves. Harmonic Sliver has all slivers destroy an artifact or enchantment when they enter for Selesnya and 1. This is an absolute terror in most games, but remember it is not a May effect, and it's pretty easy to end up taking out our own pieces, particularly with Encore. Lava Belly Sliver gives our slivers the ability to deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker when they enter, and we gain 1 life for Boros and 1, which is a good way to deal direct damage to players or remove walkers, as well as keep our life total up. Encoring this for 9 triggers can be a massive life swing when needed. Spiteful Sliver is red and 2 generic, and has us deal damage to a target player or planeswalker when our slivers take damage, another great effect for getting our opponents not to swing at us or block. Brood Sliver has all slivers create a 1/1 Sliver token when they deal combat damage to a player for 4 generic and green, and Synapse Sliver has all slivers draw their controller a card when they deal combat damage for 4 generic and blue. Lava Belly and Spiteful Sliver help reinforce my point about balancing considerations. This deck released alongside Planeswalker Party a Super Friends deck. Walkers are notoriously difficult to interact with, and while I like both of these effects without the fact that they hit walkers, their inclusion definitely feels like a way to keep that deck in check. These are all great effects that we can leverage with Encore, and were must-runs when considering what works best with Gravemother. Like I said before, a lot of this is down to personal preference, but I personally prioritize the effects that help keep us afloat with life or card draw, synergize best with a commander and other effects, and offer the most utility. Oh, also Realm Walker is in here. For 1 green and 2 generic, we get a 2/3 shapeshifter with Changeling that has us choose a creature type when it enters, lets us look at the top card of our library at any time, and allows us to cast creature spells of the chosen type from the top of our library. There's a reason it's a staple of Typal decks regardless of creature type. In addition to the Gravemother, Sliver Swarm included 9 new cards for the precon. Let's take a look at these and where they fit into the overall strategy. The first is the deck's alternate commander, Rukarumal Biologist, a 3/3 legendary human wizard for Wooburg, which has you choose a creature type as she enters, then makes slivers and non-token creatures you control the chosen creature type in addition to their other types, with this also applying to creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. You can also pay 3 generic and tap her to create a 1/1 colorless sliver creature token. So she offers us a single creature type Maskwood Nexus effect. If you were to run her as a commander, she essentially allows you to meld slivers with another creature type to hopefully get the benefits of both. But in this list she feels a bit strange. There are only 3 non-Sliver creatures including herself in the deck, one of which is a changeling anyway, and choosing anything other than Sliver doesn't really do anything. She does, however, lead a lot of modders to include the World Tree in their edits, and it makes sense. Once you have 6 lands on board, it lets you tap your lands for any color of mana, and if you choose God as the creature type when Rukaruma enters, you can pay double Wooburg to dump every creature in your deck onto the board, which is fun. For us anyway. But in the stock list, we don't have a typal payoff quite like this. At least she lets you make Titan of Littjara a Sliver in your graveyard so you can encore it. Speaking of Titan of Littjara, it's a 6/6 illusion for blue and for generic, which also has you choose a creature type when it enters, which it then becomes in addition to its other types. When it enters or attacks, you may draw a card for each other creature you control of the chosen type, then discard a card if you do. A repeatable distant melody on a body is pretty strong, but it just doesn't synergize fully with the Gravemother due to not being a Sliver in the graveyard unless you have another effect. Yes, being able to get this trigger 3 times for 6 mana is potentially huge, but it still feels frustrating that it doesn't work fully with the face commander of the deck it was made for. At least it lets us discard a card with its trigger for another encore target. We also got 5 new Slivers, which notably all have abilities that are designed to synergize with aspects of the Gravemother's design. Hatchery Sliver is a 2/2 for green and 1 generic. It has Replicate for green and 1 generic, and gives Sliver spells you control Replicate for their mana cost. Having the option to make token copies of Slivers you cast if you have the mana is great, and this is clearly designed to take advantage of Gravemother making your Slivers ignore the legend rule. So replicating Gravemother if you have the mana is very much an option, and works as a kind of protection against spot removal given you can get multiple copies on board. Being able to double up on your Slivers with triggers like Synapse or Constricting Sliver if you have the mana for Replicate is obviously another fantastic application of this ability. Next, we've got Lazotep Sliver, a 4/4 zombie Sliver for black and 3 generic that gives Slivers you control Afflict 2, where if they are blocked, the defending player loses 2 life. And whenever a non-token Sliver you control dies, amass Slivers 2. Afflict makes Lazotep Sliver a great encore target, as each instance would trigger separately, and ultimately cause a player blocking one of your Slivers to lose 6 life. The second trigger only applying to non-token Slivers is frustrating, however, given that Encore specifically has you sacrifice the tokens on your end step. Personally, I think if this was a Mass Slivers 1 for any Sliver dying, it would be fine. And given it is only ever on Lazotep itself, or 3 copies if you Encore it, this wouldn't be broken. What's one big Sliver gonna do? We touched on Regal Sliver earlier, and both it and Taunting Sliver, another 3/3 for 4 mana that gives all your Slivers the ability to goad a target creature on ETB, work great with Encore, leading to 9 triggers. And finally, Capricious Sliver is also a 3/3 for 1 red and 3 generic, and gives Slivers you control the triggered ability that whenever they deal combat damage to a player, you exile the top card of your library, which you may then play until the end of that turn. This is a good source of impulse draw, but would be hard to keep up with if you encored it, given that each Sliver that dealt combat damage would exile the top 3 cards of your library. It's basically demonic consultation for lots of Slivers, if you have enough. Exile your library. Play Thoracle. We also have Descendant's Fury, an enchantment for 1 red and 3 generic with whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice 1 of them. Then if you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card that shares a creature type with the sacrificed creature, then put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This plays great with Gravemother, as if we only have non-token Slivers on board, we can choose which to send to the yard to encore later and replace with other effects, or if we have encored something that turn, we can potentially cheat out 3 Slivers at once by sacrificing all the tokens when they deal combat damage to each player. This is the sort of scenario where Encore feels like it can really shine, but again, the support for it being limited to just a few cards in the list makes these cases a bit few and far between. Last of the new cards is For the Ancestors, an instant for green and 2 generic that has you choose a creature type, then look at the top 6 cards of your library, from which you may reveal any number of creature cards of the chosen type. Then put the revealed cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I am getting so sick of saying the word creature. It also has flashback for green and 3 generic, which is nice, and you know, it's consistent because Encore is basically flashback for creatures, you know? You see what they did there? It's a good source of draw for Typal decks, but it doesn't do anything specifically good for Gravemother. If it offered the choice of putting cards into your hand or graveyard, it would feel a bit more tailor-made for the deck, but it's definitely not a bad card. There's some good new card designs in here, particularly putting some fun new abilities on Slivers that can be abused with Encore, but like a lot of the deck, they more feel like generic Sliver and or Typal pieces to me, rather than really emphasizing the strengths of the commander. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that what makes Gravemother interesting is that she doesn't do the exact same thing as every other Sliver. Well, yes, she does give every other Sliver an ability, but the ability that she grants isn't just a buff in the same way that a stat bonus or something like First Strike is. What she does do that is unique among Slivers, however, is essentially flip your thinking when playing the creature type. If a typical Sliver game plan is entirely centered around the question, what effects do I have on board? Gravemother's game plan makes you balance that with the question, what effects do I have in my graveyard? And particularly if you don't have a means of keeping the tokens created with Encore around, which we're about to get into, when are those effects best utilized? So let's talk about the sorts of support pieces I feel that Gravemother is lacking in the core list. I think the biggest thing that makes Encore less appealing is that you get 1 turn with 3 copies of the creature you're encoring, and then it's gone forever. Well, it doesn't have to be. So that card I said we come back to, it's the Master Multiplied. For Rakdos and for generic, we get a 4/3 Time Lord Rogue with Myriad. The legend rule doesn't apply to creature tokens you control, and most importantly, triggered abilities you control can't cause you to sacrifice or exile creature tokens you control. So with the Master out, due to the weird rules distinction that the effect that has you sacrifice tokens created with Encore is a delayed triggered ability, the 3 tokens we create will hang around indefinitely. With a lot of the abilities our Slivers have, that can become a pretty scary prospect. Plus we can give the Master and all his Myriad copies all of those abilities with a Maskwood Nexus or Hivestone. If we want to build in some redundancy for this effect, we can also consider Sundial of the Infinite and Abeka Brute Chronologist. Both of these allow us to end our turn early, preventing the sacrifice trigger from ever resolving and letting our tokens stay on the board. It is important to note how this works. You must wait until the beginning of your end step, allowing the delayed sacrifice trigger to be put on the stack, then with that trigger on the stack, end the turn with either of these effects, which will exile the triggers. If you do this before the trigger is put onto the stack, it will simply delay it until the next player's end step and force you to sacrifice the tokens then, which would be sad and make you look like a bit of an idiot.
You're a third-rate
These are also pretty good protection for instant speed interaction from our opponents on our turn if we haven't encored that turn, or even if we have and the alternative is everything getting Psych Rifted. Pretty handy in a deck that is so dependent on permanence and very light on interaction. We can take this even further with Legion Loyalty, giving all of our creatures Myriad and making more token copies that we have the opportunity to keep around with these abilities. I cannot tell you how tantalizing a prospect it is to encore a Virulent Sliver, then swing the 3 copies to make 6 more copies, and give our entire board 9 instances of Poisonous 1, which, unlike Toxic or Infect, is in fact a triggered ability, and can be doubled with a Roaming Throne. Also Myriad. 30 poison counters from 1 creature, anyone?
Sting!
This trigger abuse also extends to Sidewinder Sliver, which gives all our slivers flanking, where a creature without flanking blocking them gets -1/-1 until end of turn, and Frenzy Sliver, which gives all slivers Frenzy 1, which gives an unblocked sliver +1/+0 until end of turn. Both of these are abilities of which multiple instances trigger separately. Getting multiple instances of flanking on the go is basically way better Death Touch, given it ignores Indestructible through being a stat reduction, as well as applying before damage so we don't put our slivers at risk. Meanwhile, multiple instances of Frenzy makes not blocking our slivers look like a pretty bad choice. Another sliver that feels sorely missing from this list is Homing Sliver. For red and 2 generic, all slivers in all players' hands gain Sliver Cycling 3, where we can pay 3 generic and discard the card to search our library for a sliver card, reveal it, and put it into our hand. It also has Sliver Cycling 3 itself. Yes, we will hope that no one else has a Maskwood Nexus out and that we're enabling them to go find any creature in their deck, but it lets us put an Encore target into our yard and go find another sliver that we'd rather cast, which is perfect for Gravemother. Also, this risk extends to any of the earlier sliver designs that give all slivers their ability anyway, like Quick Sliver, Synapse Sliver, Gemhide Sliver, and so on. It comes with the territory. It's also an activated ability, the cost of which can be reduced to 1 with another perfect support piece, Zerda the Dawnwaker, which reduces the cost of all of our activated abilities that aren't mana abilities by 2 generic, making all of our Encores that much cheaper. Adrix and Nev can double all the tokens that we create with Encore, Reflections of Littjara can give us token copies of all of our slivers as we cast them, particularly great given that we don't care about the legend rule, and Ashes of the Fallen can turn everything in our graveyard into slivers for just 2 mana, so we can actually Encore Titan of Littjara and draw a buttload of cards as is our goddamn right! Also, if you're a Disser player like me and haven't been turned on to this bit of tech, you are missing out. Shout out to Overfiend for bringing it to my attention when I was modding that precon. Its utility definitely extends to this list. I understand why none of these cards made it into the precon. There's not enough non-slivers to justify the creature type fixes, the Master Multiplied wasn't released yet, and it is also a Doctor Who card, and the turn ending effects are pretty niche. That being said, I think it would have been nice to see the core precon just include better support for the mechanics present on its face commander, perhaps in some of the original design slots. Sliver Gravemother is such a cool addition in the otherwise samey space that is Sliver design, and including some pieces that would help reduce the issue that people have with exiling their own stuff would have gone a long way in giving the Gravemother a bit more sticking power. Obviously, the general infamy of slivers affects this, but otherwise it's just a commander that I don't see unless someone is playing the unmodified precon. With this video, I didn't really want to create an upgrade guide for a precon released in 2023. That would be weird, right? More so, in the spirit of a complete rebuild, how I would approach better building a deck that supported the commander. With that in mind, you can find a link to the deck I've put together in the description that I hope plays better around the Gravemother and helps really bring Encore to the forefront. It's not meant to be a total powerhouse. Sure, there's some dumb interactions in there, but slivers are bad enough already, and it's suitably fragile as a result. You can probably also ignore the mana base, given that efficient Wubog mana bases, as I've already mentioned, are extremely expensive to build, and this is a list I'm actually looking to play that doesn't cost $1,000, really just to have some fun. Wild idea, I know. I'll probably be tweaking it as I go once I've got a better feel for the rest of the list, but I'm hoping this will create a more interesting play pattern for me than the usual play slivers, swing, pass. And also, amid all these considerations, it's worth saying that I don't dislike Sliver Swarm or think it's a bad product. In fact, quite the opposite. I honestly wouldn't let it take up this much brain space if I didn't care about it in some way. I also personally don't think that precons should ship as finished or perfect products. Ultimately, that would be unsatisfying to us as consumers and deck builders. The simple fact that even a precon built around an archetype as tight as Slivers still has multiple avenues of upgrading or modification is a huge testament to its design. And I want to say thank you to Gavin Verhey, Corey Bowen, Daniel Holt, Melissa DeTora, Jules Robbins, Glenn Jones, and Jeremy Geist for all their work in its design and development. Welcome to 2025. Hope you had a good end of the year. Despite the overtly terrible state of the world, I'm looking forward to what this year holds, at least as far as this channel goes. This was a fun little revisit of a commander that's been consuming a lot of my bandwidth recently, and that I really wanted to talk about, and I hope you enjoyed it. Are there any other precon commanders that you feel were underserved by the decks that supported them, and how did you personally remedy this? Have you got any other precons you'd like to see this kind of deep dive on? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks as always for watching, and if you give me a +1/+1 and like and subscribe, Thanks as always for watching, and if you give me a +1/+1 and like and subscribe, Thanks as always for watching, and if you give me a +1/+1 and like and subscribe,